Hi, my name's Jesse Beltran. I'm a retired Sacramento City firefighter-paramedic from the city of Sacramento in California. And I'm here to talk about my NDE experience and where it's led to today. When I was approximately 5 years old, I had a tonsillectomy and was being discharged. And my parents were there meeting with the doctors, and they were told how to care for me. And basically, the doctor just told them, keep me quiet, take me home, feed me ice cream. And on that evening, I went to bed as I normally would. But when I woke up in the morning, I woke up to something that was very terrifying for 5, 6 year old at that time. So I woke up in the morning, and to my astonishment, and I was very frightened, all I could see was my bed sheet completely covered in blood. The only parts of it that were not covered in blood is where I was laying um, in bed. And as soon as I saw that, I yelled for my mother. I screamed, "Mom!" And as soon as that happened, I started to hemorrhage like a fire hose, just nonstop bleeding. And my parents came in the room. They were obviously frightened with what they were seeing. They scooped me up and took me to a bathroom in the back of our home, and hoping that the bleeding would subside, and it didn't. So my father wrapped me up in a blanket so I could continue to hemorrhage into the blanket. He had a 57 Chevy, and he threw me on the floorboard. My mother called the hospital and told them that my father was on his way with me. And when we arrived, he had me in his arms, and my father was not a very emotional man, and he was in tears, and he's crying to the hospital staff, "Please save my son." They threw me on the gurney. They rushed me to the OR, and as I was in the OR, um, all I could hear is them saying, "We're losing him. We're losing him." And as those words were said, I began to elevate in the operating room, top corner, and I was watching him doing CPR on me. And then everything went black. And then in a short time thereafter, there was a light off in the distance. And so I walked to the light. And when I got to the light, it was pretty overwhelming. It was an over engulfing, encompassing feeling of unconditional love, a kind of love that as a young man at that age, I've never felt before. And one can think about who the most important people are for a child at that age. It's mom and dad. And that's a very powerful bond, a very powerful kind of love. But this love that I was engulfed with there was no comparison. It was just so much more. It was infinitely more. And I can remember just enjoying that feeling. And very shortly thereafter, a voice came to me and said, it was a male voice, "I'm sorry, it's not your time," telling me I had to go back. And as a young man, I didn't want to. I became very emotional. I remember crying, and I said, "I don't want to go back." And he, once again, the second time said, "I'm sorry, it's not your time. You have to go back." And when he said it the second time, I began to have the sensation of falling. And eventually I fell and back into my body. And I could feel the cold operating room and the gurney shaking me. And they're saying, Jesse, we got him back. We got him back." And that experience left me with some philosophical conflicts. And that philosophical conflict is I've always been raised and told that human beings have free will. And as I got older and I started to contemplate my experience, I started to question whether free will really exists. And the reason I say this, and I've shared this with others, is because if indeed we had free will, then as that little child who didn't want to come back, I always questioned why. Um, I was told it was not my time, and my decision to want to stay there was not honored. And there have been many philosophical perspectives when I've discussed this with people, and a common thing that keeps being said is that um, I was sent back for a reason, and that I had to fulfill whatever that reason was. And um, I strongly believe that that is probably the case, and that it still doesn't answer that question. And the question that I'm left with is regarding that free will is that if that is the case, that if there is a higher power that knows that you have to fulfill a destiny, then the concept of free will probably is an illusion. And the reason I say this is because many, I believe, are right that there was a destiny that had to be fulfilled. But if that is the case, then that means that destiny is already predetermined. And if it's predetermined, then ultimately, whoever that higher power is, and in my circumstances, I truly believe it was God, then God has to be the ultimate programmer. So where are we today? I've been very blessed to have many occupations and experiences in my very short life. I'm only in my 50s. And during that tenure, I became a firefighter-paramedic. And I was instrumental in helping the fire departments acquire emergency transportation services in the county and city of Sacramento, and Elk Grove, city of Elk Grove for that matter, because I took some risk that most probably wouldn't. And one of those stories is that when I was a firefighter paramedic working a shift in Grove, I concurrently was the operations manager for the private ambulance in charge of region 3 counties. But on this particular day, I was working for the fire service, and we got a call out into the suburbs of a little girl having chest pain. And so usually when you hear about children having those chest pain, usually it's due to a cold, a virus, or something of that effect, asthma. And so when we got there, I was surprised to see the 7-year-old girl, what we call a zipper. That zipper is indicative of having open heart surgery. It's the scar that you get from having that. When we arrived on scene and entered the home, what we found was a 7-year-old girl with what's called a zipper on her chest, and that zipper is indicative of it's a scar from having open heart surgery. So as soon as I saw that, I knew I wasn't dealing with something normal. This was very abnormal. We don't usually find children with cardiac anomalies on a normal basis. So when I put her on the monitor, she had what is called a wide QRS on the heart monitor, and it was indicative of what we would call slow VTAC, ventricular tachycardia. And when I called for the ETA for the private ambulance, which were my employees, they said it was 45 minutes. And unfortunately, I didn't feel comfortable waiting the 45 minutes. And on this particular day, we happened to have a white van with us, and the fire chief in his vehicle had responded to the call. Then the engine company also responded to the call. And what I decided to do was to take that little girl, put her in that white van, And the three of us, the chief, myself in the white van and the driver, and the engine company, went in tandem with lights and sirens to the nearest hospital. The very next day, it was all over the newspaper that I put this little girl in an unsanctioned ambulance. I was immediately terminated from the private ambulance companies for conflict of interest. Nonetheless, the counties and the cities had legal battles with the private ambulance companies about who should take over 911 transportation services. And even though I had relationships with both, I strongly felt that the fire department is where it needed to be. And only because I knew of logistical circumstances that really put the community in danger. Sometimes you would have one ambulance for a 3-county territory available. So I testified for the fire departments, and eventually they won, and that's how emergency transportation services started with regard to that lawsuit and the win. So moving forward, after I retired from the fire service, nonetheless, as we went code 3 with lights and sirens to the hospital, we arrived there, and the girl did survive, and we were just fortunate that everything was in sync and lined up that day, that we were able to do that. And so moving forward, after I retired from the fire service, I was blessed and cursed at the same time to become the president of an organization called the International Center Against the Abuse of Covert Technologies. The reason that was created, I had met a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Hall, who had written a book at the time called A New Breed Satellite Terrorism in America. And the book was about a phenomenon that happened to a fiance of his. And I met him in Austin, Texas at a conference, and we got on the topic of a phenomenon that was happening. And the phenomenon was that people were coming to Dr. Hall about having these really bizarre symptoms, an acute onset of some strange sounds, brain fog, short-term, long-term memory loss, vertigo, shocks to the extremities. And at the time, they kept complaining about believing they were hearing some signal being transmitted. And so Dr. Hall said, well, if we're going to use common sense here, that if indeed what they're saying is true, we should be able to detect some type of signal utilizing the correct equipment. And so what he would do, he would use what is called a JM20 Pro, which is just a frequency detector. He would scan around the person's body. And in certain cases, it would come up positive. So I said, well, that should be enough. Why isn't anything done about it? And he said, because if they go to their doctor, which we are conditioned to do, and talk about the symptoms that they are experiencing, that they will be labeled with some type of mental illness and usually be prescribed drugs, which would put them in a situation where they would be victimized again. So I decided to create the International Center Against the Abuse of Covert Technologies with the help of 2 other gentlemen, and we'll call that ISAC for short. And the reason I wanted to do this is because I said, well, if this is happening to just the handful of people you're dealing with, then there's got to be more people out there. And so I sent out disseminated information saying, hey, if you're experiencing these symptoms, please contact us. We'd love to talk to you. And I expected maybe a handful of people, but 100 people showed up in Sacramento, California. And they all had the same complaints with very, very little deviation. And it was then that I realized that we have stumbled onto something that we need to look into much closer. So I decided to do RF testing on a mass scale so that we can take these subjective complaints that people were having and turn it into objective data. And so the first meeting was held for RF scanning done in Davis, California. There were 300 people that showed up to be scanned. It was at that point that I realized this is going to turn into something potentially very, very serious and life-changing for me. And what we started seeing in the data is that those people who were most affected were Caucasian females in their 40s, recently single, widowed, or divorced, then Caucasian males, then African American females, African American males, Asians in the same um, male, female, male categories, and it dwindled down in ethnicity from there. We continued in the Midwest of the United States with the same results until we got to Chicago. It flipped. Caucasian and African American criteria changed. It was mainly, I believe, because of the demographics there. Then that stayed consistent all the way to the East Coast until we reached Virginia. In Virginia, that was a different group of people. It was about 100 or so military subcontractors who had heard about what I was doing, were having these same complaints, and wanted to have preliminary radio frequency testing done. Now I'm going to move to recently this year, May 8th of 2024, the Department of Homeland Security held a hearing with witnesses giving testimony about this phenomenon called Havana syndrome, or anomalous health incidences. And this label came in 2016 because of a complaint from our U.S. diplomats in Havana, Cuba. Started complaining of this acute onset of this strange sound, short-term, long-term memory fog, vertigo, weird electrical vibrations through the body. And initially they weren't taken seriously until Canadian diplomats started complaining of the same thing. Now on May 8th, Colonel Greg Egren gave testimony that he had evidence and conclusive position that the Havana syndrome, AHIs, is happening to our diplomats, the best of our best in the CIA, the best of our best in the FBI, and now it's happening to congressional members. And they say this is only happening to federal employees, and what they believe this was a direct. We have been following this phenomenon, documenting it. Yeah, so Colonel Egren was saying that they believe that this was a directed energy weapon, so the signal was actually being aimed at these diplomats. We felt we had a little bit different take on it. We felt that because the diplomats were also complaining that they were getting this phenomenon in their cars, their homes, no matter restaurants eating, that it followed them. And so we knew that U.S. citizens were having these exact symptoms and complaints, and they said the same thing, that they could not get rid of the signal. It followed them. So that's why we started doing the RF testing. Now, this RF testing that I started took me overseas. We had a government agency ask me to come and test their diplomats and family members and bring along any individuals who I believed were suffering from this. And the reason they had me go there is because they were going to allow me to use what is called an anechoic chamber at a research university. And I had to sign an NDA, and we used control groups of people who were not complaining of these symptoms and put them in the environment. And I'll show a video of what we've done. And they got zero frequencies detection or emissions. But when we took those who were complaining about this phenomenon in there, who came up positive in our preliminary scans, and we put them in the anechoic chamber, which was rated to block out frequencies between 9 kilohertz and 18 gigahertz, we detected frequency emissions. And they were in the same environment as the controls group. We would have the control in the environment and the symptomatic person. We'd test them both. The control group would always come back at 0, but those who tested positive in the preliminary scans had frequency emissions detected. So what does this mean? What this meant is we always had the suspicion or theory that if this signal is following them everywhere, that there has to be something unique or special about the individual internally that allowed them to receive this signal. And I'm going to share with the audience exactly what we have found. I'm going to be sharing my screen here. And what we have found, and this is going to be a study that was done on one of my earliest clients, and she's a very sweet lady. And this is a photomicrographic report of 3 specimens that were removed from her person that were found to be biosensors. And these biosensors were reaching sizes approaching nano size. So this is a nanowire. This is the biosensor. Our bodies do not reject them. And this is one type that was removed from her. This is a secondary biosensor that was removed from her. Here is another one. Now, this going through this process allowed us to come to this conclusion that we knew that there was something going on and that it had to be something internal with them. And this is what we're finding with this phenomenon, that the reason they are receiving the signal is because they have these biosensors that are being pulled. Now, I'll give you a little history on where we started and to where we are today. Now, when we started, this is a Bob Boyce case. He was an inventor of a high-efficiency engine. He developed terminal cancer. And when I spoke to Bob on the phone, he said, look, I had just succumbed, that I was going to die from this disease. And he utilized the same process we did. He was in what is called a Faraday cage, which is a little smaller version of the anechoic chamber that I was talking about earlier. And he used the same type of device that we have. And the wand passed by his shoulder and it pinged. And lo and behold, he thought that was odd. So he went and got an x-ray, and there in the x-ray was a microchip in the middle of the cancerous tumor. Now, I asked Bob, he had it surgically removed, and I asked him, so what happened to the chip? And he says, well, it disappeared after pathology. Nonetheless, he was just happy that his cancer had gone into remission after this surgery. And shortly thereafter, unfortunately, his cancer came back very aggressively. So he immediately got back into the Faraday cage and rescanned himself, and it came up positive again. This time, they used a chain of custody and were not going to allow this microchip to get out of their hands. And lo and behold, number 2 was pulled out of him. And they were able to trace the serial number on this microchip back to an NSA database. So how did it get him, Bob, is the big question. So Bob loved Mountain Dew. And one day his business partner, while at work, and he was in his office, brought him a can of Mountain Dew. And he lost track of time. He said 3 days later, he woke up. Well, lo and behold, his business partner worked for the NSA. And so Bob was drugged, and these were injected into his person, and he developed cancer. And just so the audience can see just how advanced we are today, this is another case. This is the Dave Larson case. He was a politician in Southern California. He had over 10 of these implants pulled out of him. Now, this is late 1990s, early 2000s. And this is one biosensor. Look at the letters on the penny. This is how small they were at that time. They're in various sizes and types. This one here is about 4 letters on a penny. But nonetheless, Mr. Larson sued, and he lost. And the reason he lost is because he inadvertently signed up to participate in an experiment. And had he been given full disclosure, he would never have participated in the experiment. And so this is where we are today. Now, everyone says this sounds like conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat type stuff. And I'm about to read the smoking gun. Here is a case. It's called the Don DeVore case. This was filed in Southern California. She was a nurse who worked for the Department of Corrections and became a whistleblower. In this case, in Exhibit 2 that she shares for the courts as evidence, she intercepted a highly secret, confidential memo. And this was only meant for high-level management people in the prisons. And this is, the header is IntelliConnection, a security division of IBM. And it says confidential, limited distribution only, level 9 communication. And it's titled 2020 Neural Chip Implant. And it reads, the control of crime will be a paramount concern in the 21st century. We must be ready with our security products when the demand for them become popular. Our research and development team has been in contact with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the California Department of Corrections, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and the Massachusetts Department of Corrections to run limited trials of the 2020 neural chip implant. We have established representatives of our interest in both management and institutional levels within these departments. So they're getting their own employees hired. Federal regulations do not yet permit testing of implants on prisoners, but we have entered into contractual agreements with privatized healthcare professionals and specified correctional personnel to do limited testing of our products. We have also had major success in privately owned sanitariums with implant technology. We need, however, to expand our testing to research how effective the 2020 neurochip implant performs in those identified as most aggressive in our society. Limited testing has produced a number of results. In California, several prisoners were identified as members of a security threat group. They were brought to the health services unit of the Pelican Bay and tranquilized with advanced sedatives developed by our Cambridge, Massachusetts laboratory. The implant procedure takes 60 to 90 minutes depending upon the experience of the technician. We are working on a device which will reduce that time by as much as 60%. The results of implants on 8 prisoners yielded the following results. Implants served as surveillance monitoring devices for the threat group. And I want you to remember that because that's important. Implants disabled 2 subjects during an assault on correctional staffs. How they did that is they sent a specific frequency to the implants, and it completely contracts the muscles, and it's like being hit with a stun gun. Universal side effects in all 8 test subjects revealed that when the implant was set to 116 megahertz, all subjects became lethargic and slept on an average of 18 to 22 hours per day. So they were inducing lethargy just by sending a specific frequency. All subjects refused recreation periods for 14 days. Obviously, if you're lethargic, you're not going to exercise or want to do anything active. Each subject was monitored for aggressive activity during the test period, and the findings are conclusive that out of the 8 test subjects exhibited no aggression even when they were provoked. Each subject experienced only minor bleeding from the nose and ears 48 hours after the implant due to initial adjustment. Each subject had no knowledge of the implant for the test period, and each implant was retrieved under the guise of medical treatment. And that is a serious violation of the Nuremberg Code. Any experimentation, all subjects, even prisoners, have to be given full consent. They have to give their full consent to participate. It should be noted that the test period was for less than 2 months. However, during the period, substantial data was gathered by our research and development team, which suggests that the implants exceeded expected results. One of the major concerns of the security and R&D team, research and development team, was that the test subject would discover the chemical imbalance during the initial adjustment period, and the test would have to be scrubbed. However, due to the advanced technological developments in the sedatives administered, the 48-hour adjustment period can be attributed to prescription medication given to the test subjects after the implant procedure. So instead of telling them the truth, that their bodies, what they were experiencing was the rejection of their bodies having these implants put in them, and they blame it on the drugs. One of the concerns raised by the R&D team was the cause of the bleeding and how to eliminate that problem. Unexplained bleeding might cause the subject to inquire further about the routine visit in the infirmary or the health care facility. Security windfall from the brief test period was enormous. Security officials now 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 know several strategies employed by the threat group that facilitate the transmission of illegal drugs and weapons into their correctional facilities. One intelligence officer remarked that while they cannot use the information they have in a court of law now, they know who to watch out for outside with their connections they have. The prison at Soledad is now considering transferring 3 subjects to Vacaville Prison, where we have ongoing implant research. Vacaville Prison has been doing this research since the early 70s on prisoners. And we have documents that through a FOIA release that specifically outline this as the case. It goes, our technicians have promised that they can do 3 2020 neurochip implants in less than an hour. Soledad officials hope to collect information from the trio to bring a 14-month investigation into drug trafficking by correctional officers to a close. Essentially, the implants make the unsuspecting prisoner a walking, talking recorder of every event he comes into contact with. So not only can they hear everything when you have this in you, they can also read your EEG. They also know what you're thinking about. They also know what you're seeing. That's how advanced this phenomenon is. There are only 5 intelligence officers and the Commissioner of Corrections who actually know the full scope of the implant testing. In Massachusetts, Department of Corrections has already entered into high-level discussions about releasing certain offenders to the community with the 2020 neurochip implants. So they're sending them out into the community, and still utilizing the information or intel gathering without any warrants, and doing this unconstitutionally. Our people are not altogether against the idea. However, attorneys for IntelliConnection have advised against implant technology outside strict control settings. Under the present governmental structure, our liability would be enormous. While we have a strong lobby in Congress and various state legislatures favoring our product, we must proceed with the utmost caution on uncontrolled use of the 2020 neurochip implant. If the chip were discovered in use not authorized by law and the procedure traced to us, we could not endure for long the resulting publicity and liability payments. And I think that's probably enough to share this document, but the fact that it exists really brings it home. And even though this is a recent document, but this lawsuit was done in 2019, people ask, how long has this been in the making? How long has this idea of utilizing technology to be implanted in people been around? I can say this, that then Senator Joe Biden in 2005, when they were confirming Edwards as a Chief Justice, Biden said to him, he says, mark my words, that during your lifetime, during your tenure, you will have to decide whether or not it is legal to implant a microchip in a human, whether or not that is constitutionally viable. He was literally asked during that confirmation. That was in 2005. Now, what I have here is a declassified document that was obtained through a FOIA request. We obtained it in 1995, but this was actually released in November of 1994. This is the Defense Technical Information Center report. This is basically done by the United States Air Force, and this was their greatest minds to put together a project that would keep the United States Air Force a superpower 50 years into the future. Now, this is a 225-page document. I made a short of this only because I wanted to address page 89 of the report, which is titled Biological Processes Control. Now, I'll read the highlighted areas, and then I'll start to show you how we obtain the evidence. It appears likely that there are a number of physical agents that might actively but largely benignly interact with or interfere with biological processes in an adversary in a manner that will provide our armed forces the tools to control these adversaries without extensive loss of life or property. These physical agents could include acoustic fields, optical fields, electromagnetic fields, and combinations thereof. This paper will address only the prospect of physical regulation of biological processes using electromagnetic fields. It says prior to the mid 21st century, there will be a virtual explosion in the knowledge in the field of neuroscience. We will have achieved a clear understanding of how the human brain works, how it really controls various functions of the body, and how it can be manipulated both positively and negatively. One can envision the development of electromagnetic energy sources, the output of which can be pulse-shaped and focused, that can couple with the human body in a fashion that will allow one to prevent voluntary muscular movements. Remember the prisoners. Control emotions and thus actions, produce sleep, transmit suggestions, interfere with both short-term, long-term memory. Remember the diplomats. Produce an experience set and delete an experience set. This will open the door for the development of some novel capabilities that can be used in armed conflict and terrorist hostage situations and in training. New weapons that offer the opportunity of control of an adversary without resorting to a lethal solution or collateral casualties can be developed around this concept. This would offer significant improvements in the capabilities of our special operations forces. Initial experimentation should be focused on the interaction of electromagnetic and the neuromuscular junctions involved in voluntary muscle control. Here's where it gets really crazy. It would also appear possible to create high-fidelity speech in the human body, raising the possibility of covert suggestion and psychological direction. When a high-power microwave pulse in the gigahertz range strikes the human body, a very small temperature perturbation occurs. This is associated with a sudden expansion of the slightly heated tissue. This expansion is fast enough to produce an acoustic wave. If a pulse stream is used, it should be possible to create an internal acoustic field in the 5 to 15 kilohertz range, which is audible. Thus, it may be possible to talk to selected adversaries in a fashion that would be most disturbing to them. In comparison to the discussion in the paragraphs above, the concept of imprinting an experience set is highly speculative but nonetheless highly exciting. Modern electromagnetic scattering theory raises the prospect that ultra-short pulse scattering through the human brain can result in reflected signals and then can be used to construct reliable estimate of degree of central nervous system arousal. The concept behind the remote EEG is to scatter off action potentials or ensembles of action potentials in major central nervous system tracts. Assuming we will understand how our skills are imprinted and recalled, it might be possible to take this concept one step further and duplicate the experience set in another individual. So what they're talking about is imprinting false memories. And I didn't mention that I am a certified master hypnotist with my diploma in hypnotherapy. And the reason I did that was because I started to notice the phenomenon that was happening in the United States with people who were most affected by this. And what I found is that they were highly suggestible. Now, 30% of the population is naturally highly suggestible, according to some studies. And the reason I bring this up is many years back, there was a Canadian psychiatrist by the name of Ewan Cameron. He was funded by the United States government to experiment on humans to see whether or not he can erase their memories and imprint new memory sets, so false memories. And he would use things like electrical shock therapy, drug therapy, induced long-term sleep through drug therapy, and he would put a helmet over their head. In that was a tape recorder that would replay over and over again looped themes and messages. And this really messed people up. And today the lawsuits are still ongoing in Canada for what Ewan Cameron did. And The reason I mention this is because that in its infancy was called psychic driving. What we're dealing with today is we're dealing with psychic driving on steroids. And people asked, and they said, "Well, do do you think your NDE experience has anything to do with what you're working on today?" And I would say 100% yes. Um, I just stumbled into this phenomenon, and I wanted to show the audience the methodology that we used in order to come to where we are with this conclusion, and how we derived at pulling out, surgically removing implants out of humans who said that they were receiving some strange signal. And what I'm going to share with you, hopefully this will work, is our process. So this is actual Colonel Greg Eggerin giving testimony at the House Homeland Security Subcommittee meeting about this specific topic. You can actually go online and listen to the entire hearing. I encourage everyone to do that because it's very important. So this here is our radio frequency scan that we do, the preliminary scan out in the field. This woman is a licensed medical professional, well respected within the community, who was complaining about these specific symptoms. Now, this is a JM20 Pro. This is a frequency detector. It is meant to find locations where there are frequency emissions. Now, she comes up positive in the temporal mandibular joint. It's the area where whenever you go to the dentist and they give you a shot back there to numb you up. Notice how I have her move away from the wand and get close to it. It activates. Then eventually I'll have her step away and step towards it, and it activates. Now this will only go off in very specific focal areas. So what we'll do is we'll tag it so that we can come back and use a frequency counter to see if we can detect an actual frequency. Just so I don't bore everyone and go through the slow process of this, I'm going to show you exactly what I'm referring to when we come back with the frequency counter. This is an Anaco frequency counter. And in this particular case, she probably had one of the strongest signals ever detected in a preliminary scan. She did have her partner there, and I'm actually talking to him, describing the fact that I found it very unusual at how strong this signal is that we detect, and that they need to take a closer look at that area with additional radiographic imagery. You can see that we're detecting a signal. That bar graph is pinging, and normally we'll see maybe one or two bar graphs when we're doing this scan. So that is the preliminary scan. And what we'll do is we'll ask for medical imagery. This is an MRI scan. And if you notice there, you can actually see an RFID chip, very similar to what was removed from Bob Boyce. But ultimately, and then we'll do what is called a nonlinear junction scan. It's a more advanced scan. But what I want to get to is the anechoic chamber. This is actually the actual film of when we were overseas in Europe and scanning symptomatic individuals and non-symptomatic individuals as controls. This first episode here is the phase 3 testing of the non-symptomatic person. This is actually someone from the embassy there in Europe. And so we do the same process as I was doing earlier with a medical professional. And she came up with no frequency detections with the JM20 Pro. Then we followed up in the TMJ just so that we can demonstrate that if we were in the right environment, that we should get 0 readings in this environment, regardless of where we're at, because it's rated to block those frequency ranges out. So this is, again, the frequency counter. And whenever that's flashing, it's scanning for frequencies. We get 0. So in this next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to bring This is another control non-symptomatic, the same results. We got 0. Where we knew that we can conclude that the emission was coming from the human body is in this demonstration here. This is a symptomatic person who came up positive in the preliminary radio frequency scan. And notice how we are getting frequency detections. So we'll get it down to, we get the strongest frequency reading. And then we'll have her switch spots with the symptomatic person. And remember, she tested 0 earlier. And notice when we scan her again, the same locations, 0. This is how we concluded, ultimately, how these transmissions were coming from the human body. And that's my story. For anyone wanting any of this information, these documents, I'll leave a link that you can look at. It's accessible. We're very transparent about all of this information, and it's important that you get educated in this. The first line of defense is knowing, number one. Now, there's 2 cases that I'm going to talk about. One is Aaron Alexis and one is Myron May. Aaron Alexis was a U.S. soldier who called me complaining about these symptoms. Fortunately, he was not the personality type to just stand by and do nothing or be patient. He had no patience whatsoever. And there's another case called Myron May, who was an attorney out of Florida. And he also called me complaining about these symptoms. Now, what Aaron Alexis ended up doing, because he didn't want to go through the long process of testing, he decided to take action on his own, and he killed 16 people at the Navy Yard on the East Coast. Myron May killed 3 people at the university there in the research department because they believed that this is where this signal was coming from. And in fact, Aaron Alexis inscribed, "This is my ELF weapon," on the butt of the gun that he used. Now, both of these gentlemen were killed during their events. And the reason I mention that is because if you are one of those unfortunate ones who are highly suggestible and you have this phenomenon basically forced upon you, then you are at high risk of doing something that you would not normally do, just by virtue of what you can do with this technology. And so if you go to our website at www.mindnexuslive.com, you can take a suggestibility test there. It's free. If you test highly suggestible, we'll eventually reach out to you. But remember, we're getting thousands of inquiries a week, so it is taking some time to get through all of them. In addition, if you think that you or someone you care about or someone you know is going through this phenomenon, you can inquire about getting RF testing to see what your results might be. And that's where we're at. Well, no, I did, and maybe it's not as clear. The question is there free will? If there was free will, I wouldn't be here speaking to you today. I would have been allowed to stay there. But I believe that ultimately God is the ultimate programmer. And therefore, this is why I've come to this philosophical debate, is free will an illusion? At least in my case, that child wholeheartedly wanted to stay there. And even to this day, I remember that feeling. I would have said the same thing. I still probably would have wanted to stay there and leave the kind of love that my mom and dad had for me. They were very loving parents. But if I didn't come back from my NDE, I wouldn't have been here to expose this. And myself and very, very few people on this planet right now have experience doing this type of testing and have as much knowledge with this particular phenomenon. And I'll say this, I had the top doc of a 3-letter agency contact me not too long ago. We're talking just a few months ago. And you have to ask, why would someone of that caliber even take the time to give me a phone call? And when he called me, he told me why. He says, "Well, you and Dr. Hall are interesting individuals," and he said, "The only reason I'm calling you is because you're pulling implants out of people." And he wanted to know more. Really, I think he just wanted to know how much we knew. And what I said to him, and then he asked me, he goes, "Are you looking for recognition for this?" And I go, "No. And in fact, I hate being out in the forefront about this." He said, "The only reason I contacted you or sent you an email is because I was told by someone very credible, high up, that you guys do not know what to do for these people who are these federal employees who are having this phenomenon." And so all I wanted to do was share a different perspective about, number one, we've been following this for quite some time in the homeland. And even though you guys claim that it's not happening to civilians, I'm here to tell you that it is. And we have the documentation and we have the proof. Um, but the reason I'm reaching out to you is because I truly care. And if those federal employees, if it's true, you guys don't know what's going on with them, that you might want to consider doing RF testing on them, because this is outside the scope of medicine. This particular physician was in charge of 330 federal employees who are currently diagnosed with Havana syndrome and family members. Hope that answers that question.